This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen.
And this week's case takes us to Fresno, California. Fresno is the county seat of Fresno County and has a population of about 525,000 people. It's comprised of about 116 square miles of landmass and has a median household income of $32,236. One of the kind of neater things about Fresno, I did find out that in Spanish, Fresno means ash tree, and the city was built in an area with a bunch of ash trees, so that's how Fresno got its name. It is also noteworthy that it is the closest major city to Yosemite National Park.
The case began on Friday, March 12, 2004. Fresno police responded to a domestic disturbance over a child custody dispute at 761 West Hammond Avenue, and this all occurred around 2 p.m. When police arrive, they find a confrontation between two large groups of people. So this scene is chaotic, with around 25 to 30 people, including some young children, involved in this disturbance. There was a large group in the yard and a group inside the home. So officers are trying to find out what's going on and calm the situation, and they speak to Ruby Ortiz and Sofina Solorio, who had been the ones to call the police. Ruby and Sofina say they want to retrieve their children from the home that had been living there with their uncle, Marcus Wesson. Ruby's child was 7-year-old Aviv Wesson, and Sofina's child was 7-year-old Jonathan St. Charles Wesson. The women are very amped up, but the uncle and the man who owns the home, Marcus Wesson, is very calm, and he talks with police near the front door of the Wesson home. He tells police he's going to cooperate with them. He says that the two children had lived in the family home since birth, and it was Ruby and Sofina who agreed to let the children stay there with Marcus. So during speaking with all parties, you have a few officers on the scene, and then all this commotion. During this, Marcus Wesson goes away from the front door and enters a bedroom in the rear of the home and shuts the door. Family members inform police that Wesson does own a firearm. So the police begin to evacuate everyone from inside the home and move people away, and a standoff begins with Marcus Wesson. Responding officers, who are very much outnumbered at this point, are trying to get a SWAT team and negotiators on the scene. But before that happens, the standoff ends after an hour and 20 minutes. And how it ends is a very calm Marcus Wesson exits the front of the home with blood on his clothes. Officer Eloy Escarino enters the home, goes into that back bedroom where Marcus Wesson had been, and finds a pile of 9 bodies, all deceased. There was a 25-year-old female, a 17-year-old female, and 7 children ages 1 to 8. The deceased are later identified as Sabrina April Wesson, 25, Elizabeth Briani, or she went by Lise, or Elizabeth Jr., who was 17, Illabelle Carrie Wesson, who was 8, Jonathan St. Charles Wesson, who was 7, Aviv Dominique Wesson, who was 7, Ethan St. Laurent Wesson, who was 4, Marcy St. Christopher Wesson, who was 1.5, Sedona Vadra Wesson, who was 1.5, and Jiva Wesson, who was 1. All of the deceased are the children and grandchildren of 57-year-old Marcus Wesson. So Marcus Wesson is arrested on the scene on the suspicion of 9 counts of murder. This is the worst mass murder in Fresno history. So the police have to further investigate this. I mean, they have Marcus Wesson in custody, but they really aren't sure what has gone on. It's a mess. Who were the victims? The 2 oldest, Sabrina and Lise, were daughters of Marcus Wesson and his wife, Elizabeth. All the other young children were either his children or his grandchildren. They start with autopsies of the victim. Each victim has been shot through the eye with a .22 caliber handgun. The cause of death was immediate perforation of the brain caused by gunshot wound. But police report hearing no gunshots. Later, some of the family members say they thought they heard gunshots. As far as forensics, there was no gunshot residue on the hands of Marcus or any of the victims. On the gun, there were no fingerprints, but they did find DNA, and it was not that of Marcus Wesson. It was that of the oldest victim, Marcus's daughter, Sabrina. The gun and a hunting knife were found under the body of Sabrina. So all the victims were piled up with Lise and then Sabrina on the very top. The surviving children of Marcus Wesson supported their father and said there is no way that he could have done this, and they all felt that Sabrina was the one who did it.
So we obviously have a strange situation going on here. We've got the family who's supporting this guy who it kind of looks obvious to everyone else that he's probably responsible for these deaths. To kind of get a better feel for it, we have to take a deeper dive into the Wesson family and the dynamics of that family. Marcus Wesson was born August 22nd, 1946 in Kansas. He was born to hardworking Seventh-day Adventist parents, and his father was also reportedly an alcoholic. The family moved to California when Marcus was in his teens, and after high school, Marcus joined the Army, where his job was as an ambulance attendant and a driver in Germany. After only 2 years of active duty in the Army, in 1968, Marcus returned to California where he met a woman named Rosemary Soloro in San Jose, and he moved in with her and her 7 children. Rosemary was about 13 years Marcus's senior. Marcus and Rosemary had their first son in 1971. One of Rosemary's children from a previous relationship, her previous husband, was Elizabeth Soloro. Elizabeth claims that when she was 8 years old, she and Marcus, who had been 21 at this time, had a private wedding ceremony in the home and that they were actually married. An 8-year-old and a 21-year-old. So I know it's hard to keep up with. By the age of 14, Elizabeth is pregnant. When Elizabeth was 15 and Marcus was 27, with the blessing of Elizabeth's mother, she and Marcus were, I guess, legally married at that point. Marcus had married his live-in girlfriend's daughter, is the long and the short of it. I know it's kind of hard to follow, but Marcus eventually legally marries his live-in girlfriend's daughter. 4 months after they wed, Elizabeth gives birth to their first child. In total, Elizabeth birthed 10 children with Marcus Wesson. During their marriage, 7 of Elizabeth's nieces and nephews, which would have been her sister's children, moved in with them, making it a total of about 20 people who lived in the Wesson household. Now, at the time of the case, Marcus is a large man. He's 6 feet tall and a little over 300 pounds. He had very long dreadlocks that went down to his waist. He was a physically imposing figure. Marcus didn't allow the kids to attend school, but they did homeschool all the children, and the daily lessons would include lengthy Bible lessons, but only out of Marcus Wesson's version of the Bible. And these lessons from his approved Bible focused on his particular strange beliefs and taught other things like polygamy. Wesson didn't work because he, quote, had to impart his divine wisdom on the family. He preached the dangers of the outside world and said that polygamy was the way of God and that he, Marcus Wesson, was the real Jesus and the divine ruler. He frequently told the children and the other family members, if you've seen God, you've seen me. The female members of the home were not allowed to speak or have contact with any of the male members of the family, except, of course, as you might have guessed, with Marcus. This rule was strictly enforced. In fact, All of Marcus's rules were strictly enforced, and he demanded complete and total obedience. The boys of the family were taught to leave home once they reached 18, and they did that. But the girls were taught to never leave home. When they would go out of the house together, they all had to walk behind Marcus. Females of the family were required to dress in these very modest manner with long skirts and that kind of thing. Once the kids were old enough, especially the girls, they were sent to get jobs, usually beginning at McDonald's or another fast food restaurant, and they brought all of their paycheck home to Marcus. He was unemployed and was supported financially by all of these women in the family. With this money, Marcus purchased the homes and other things for the family. I wouldn't say that he necessarily supported him. The women were earning all the money. One of the homes that they lived in was this rusted out boat, and then they once lived in the mountains in an army surplus tent, and they did this for about 12 years with no running water and a makeshift non-functional toilet. They lived in a home that had been damaged in a fire, and the current home at the time of the case in Fresno was zoned commercial and wasn't even really a home that was zoned for a family to live in. There was also a school bus parked in the driveway. And that is kind of what sparked the whole confrontation. The family was being ordered to relocate from the commercial property. The zoning officials had said, hey, you can't live here. It's not a family dwelling. You got to have a business here. And Wesson planned to move the entire family to Washington. And that's what kind of sparked a confrontation. Ruby and Safina wanted to retrieve their children because they didn't want the kids going to Washington. They had already left them, and they wanted the children to stay in Fresno with them.
But to get a little bit further into this family, we're going to need to know a few things that we don't know already. DNA testing showed that all of the victims were fathered by Marcus Wesson. The mothers of the children were his wife, Elizabeth, his daughters, Sabrina and Kiani, and his nieces, Ruby and Safina and Rose. When the girls reached the age of about 8, Marcus Wesson would begin to teach the girls what he called loving. He started with touching, and then he would move to oral sex, and then eventually, before they reached teenage years, it was penetration. He was teaching the girls how to please a future husband, although he had the same ceremony with them that he had had with Elizabeth, where they were married. So these girls married their father or their uncle. Elizabeth, his wife, said she was unaware of the sexual abuse on the female children. She said the girls didn't tell her, so she didn't know. The girls were instructed to tell everyone they became pregnant through artificial insemination. But the girls saw themselves as surrogates for Elizabeth because Elizabeth could no longer bear children. Marcus told the family that they needed to create more children for the Lord. Safina once tried to leave, but she was stabbed in the chest by Marcus. The Department of Social Services, Department of Human Resources, Child Protection Services had never been called on the family. But Marcus had been arrested and convicted for perjury and welfare fraud in Santa Cruz County several years before the case. Current neighbors said they did not even realize children lived in that building. Marcus Wesson was also a huge supporter and even an admirer of David Koresh and what David Koresh had created with the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. In total, it was reported that Marcus Wesson fathered 18 children with a total of 7 women: his legal wife, his mother-in-law, 2 of his daughters, and 3 of his nieces.
That conclusion right there is just, incredible. What do you say about that? But it doesn't really end there. There's more to this situation and this family dynamic. Remember, I had said earlier that he preached from the Bible, but it was his version of the Bible. And his version of the Bible was the Bible mixed with vampire culture. Police recovered 12 antique coffins from the home, and Marcus had purchased these in the months and years before the murders. He said the wood was good to make beds for the kids, but police were able to determine through evidence that the children were sleeping in the coffins. He taught them that Jesus was a vampire and that the end times were near, and he even gave some of the children vampire names. He wrote in his version of the Bible that drinking blood was the key to immortality. And they even used the term fledglings, and this is the term they used for people who go out and do the vampire's work. They were the females of the group that would be required to do this. So, his daughter and wives and nieces and, women that he was engaged in these sexual encounters with, who were the fledglings that would need to go out and do the vampire's work. So we mentioned that Marcus was arrested, and at trial we learned that Ruby and Safina had left the family, but they had agreed to leave their children with Marcus and the rest of the family until they were 7 or 8, at which time Ruby and Safina would retrieve them. There's some thought that this 7 or 8 number isn't just arbitrary, and that this was to make sure that he had lived with them long enough to kind of train them up in the way that he wanted, and then he knew, or he speculated, that they wouldn't voluntarily go to their mothers at that point. We also learned that the day of the incident, when Ruby and Safina went to get their children, Safina was able to get into the home and grab her son by the arm, but then someone pulled him away from her. Marcus had blocked the front door to keep anyone else from entering. Kiani, Sabrina, Rose, and Lise all yelled at Safina that she was an adulterer and began yelling "Judas, Judas" at her during the confrontation before police arrived. Sabrina yelled at Ruby to bow down to her master, and she actually pointed at Marcus's feet. The children and Marcus's only legal wife, remember, I know because this is very confusing, but Marcus's only legal wife is this 8-year-old that he eventually married at 15, and they all supported him. They claimed that he was a great father and provided for them. He had taught them many things and took good care of them. At trial, his daughter Kiani testified that there's nothing wrong with sexual contact between father and daughter. She said that the children in the house did what they did by choice, that they had a democratic family and they were all happy. There was no rape because it was all consensual. Now, the boys of the family did not have knowledge of what went on with the girls in the house because they were kept apart from each other. Obviously, Marcus is charged with these 9 counts of murder, but the problem that the prosecution has is they couldn't directly say that Marcus had pulled the trigger and killed any of the family members. Remember, Jen mentioned we had this where we didn't really hear the shots, and we had gunshot residue tests that didn't say that he had any gunshot residue on his hand. And the defense jumped all over the forensic evidence and said that Sabrina had killed the other 8 people and then turned the gun on herself. And based on evidence, there was some substance to this claim. However, the prosecution was able to present that Marcus had such control and had brainwashed everybody to the point that they would do anything he wanted. If you think about it, everyone in this house had undergone so much mental, physical, and sexual abuse. They knew nothing other than what he told them, and almost all of them had been under his control since they were born. So it really was all they ever knew. He had preached to them that the police were not there to help them and were essentially devils in blue uniforms with badges. He said if anyone ever tried to break the family apart, that it would be better that they all die in order to be together, that they all die together to remain together. This was presented kind of as a murder-suicide pact, because you got to think about what's going on outside at this point, right? You had all these, I hate to use the word fanatic, but they really were, in essence, Marcus fanatics in the house, and now the devils with blue uniforms and badges are at the door. This is a critical situation in the home. They're worried that these people are here to break the family up. It was presented that this could have been a murder-suicide pact. This control is what would have made Sabrina kill 8 of her siblings and then herself. he may not have had to pull the trigger. He could have told her to do it, and he had such a sphere of control over these people that she would carry that out. And the jury agreed that it was Marcus who had committed the murders, and the weapon that he used to commit those murders was, in fact, Sabrina herself. And on June 17th, 2005, he was convicted on multiple charges of sex abuse and murder and was sentenced to death. He now sits on death row with some other notable serial killers, Charles Ng and Carrie Stainer, although it is unlikely that he will ever die at the hands of the state.
During the trial, most of the family, the children, the wife, all but Ruby and Safina, everybody else pretty much supported Marcus. But years after the murder and the trial, the family began to see the wrong in Marcus Wesson. That deprogramming of them started. And they realized that they lived in an abusive family cult with a man who was narcissistic and delusional. They came forward with stories of their time with Marcus. Elizabeth said she once tried to leave Marcus, but he choked her to unconsciousness and told her if she ever tried to leave again, he would kill her. Some of the things the kids had to do, they had to forage for aluminum cans. Before they were old enough to work, they had to go out looking for cans to help bring money in. Now, Marcus, B told you he was a big guy, over 6 foot and over 300 pounds. He would eat hamburgers and junk food, but the food intake of everyone else in the house was strictly regulated. He would eat well, and they might have beans and fruit, or if they were really lucky, they would get McDonald's hamburgers that Marcus had retrieved from the restaurant dumpster. The girls had to wash his dreadlocks and scratch his armpits. And the girls were beaten for speaking with men. His son, Fino, tells of some of these beatings. He said they were usually beaten with things such as a cable wire, and some punishment would last for weeks or even months. For example, a 30-day punishment, that would mean 21 strikes in the morning, 21 strikes in the afternoon, and 21 before bedtime. 30 straight days in a row. Fino said he was once beaten for sneaking a spoonful of peanut butter, and he said this was one of those 30-day beatings. Sometimes they would get beaten for asking a simple question or just having the wrong vibe. Marcus would also dig a grave and tell the child it was for them if they did anything wrong.
Just a horrible, horrible guy. And after Marcus was arrested, the family didn't fare so well even then. I mean, you would think, hey, this guy's in jail, they're out from under this, things will be looking up for them. But not necessarily so. People saw them as outcasts or even co-conspirators. But in essence, they were actually Marcus's victims too. And so this reporter, Alicia Sophias, met with the family, and against her better judgment and really crossing a line in journalism, she invited 3 of the Wesson women to live in her apartment with her. She knew that this was going to end her career because this is getting way too close to the subject of her journalism, but she knew they had nothing or anyone else to go to. I mean, that was it, the only option. Elizabeth was one of those women, and she actually filed for divorce from Marcus. Alicia continued to help the family, and she still works in journalism and actually wrote a book with the family that's titled Where Hope Begins. This is just a very convoluted and crazy case, but there's probably a couple of points that our listeners are wondering about. And one of the things that sticks out to me that people might wonder is, how did 9 gunshots happen? Whether Marcus did it or the daughter did it, Sabrina, how did that happen and it not be heard? Well, that's possible. So it was a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. That is a pretty easy thing to happen. You're in a commercial building, number one. It wasn't a building that was zoned for residential. Commercial buildings are constructed in a manner that a little more heavy duty that might help muffle some of that sound. But to me, just from the outside looking in, the big determining factor, I've been to some pretty hectic domestic related scenes that didn't have near this many people. You got to remember, there's 20 to 25 involved parties plus the officers that are arriving. In my mind, I'm thinking, hey, the first one or two cars that gets there sees this large collection of people and they go, uh-oh, 25 people, we got to sort through all this. We're going to need some more help. So they would radio this in, and some more patrol units would probably arrive at the scene. So what if we have 4 or 5 policemen there now? Well, when Marcus barricades himself, all right, you've got the chaos and hectic nature of the 25 people. You've got frantic mothers trying to retrieve their children. You got 4 or 5 police officers trying to control the situation. You got a guy that barricades himself in his back bedroom, which is going to prompt the response of way more officers. All right. And so we're looking at a scene. We don't have an exact count, but it could have had 35 people there or 40 people there. And all those people are talking and police radios are going off. And it is not surprising that with this loud, chaotic scene, the police didn't hear a .22 caliber pistol, which it's loud, but it could fairly easily be muffled by that much ambient noise.
I agree with you. And I've been in situations, like you said, not quite that big, everybody's yelling, and we have our police radio mics mounted on our shoulders right by our ears and have it turned up, and it's talking, and you're not really hearing the people screaming and what they're saying, and even sometimes that screaming overwhelms your police radio, which is right at your ear, and you don't hear it. So I think I saw where people said, oh, the police were lying, that they didn't hear it because they didn't go into the house to try to get them out and let them kill all these kids. I don't think the police were lying. I think they did not hear the shots. And when they did the autopsies, it showed that the children died possibly an hour before the older two. So it could have been initially when the police get there and the chaos is going on before he's even barricaded, that Sabrina killed the others, and then, there toward the end, killed herself. We don't know the exact way it happened, but I agree 100% with you, which is not usually what I do, but 100%. I believe the shots went off and it was impossible to hear.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that too loud that you agree with me. The listeners might lose faith in you. But another thing I think that people kind of naturally wonder too is, you saw that we had the standoff last an hour and 20 minutes. And I think people outside the realm of law enforcement may wonder what's happening in that time. How long does it take to get a SWAT team there? Or how long does it take to get negotiators there? And those things take time, especially in a metropolitan area like Fresno. From my SWAT team days, which are long since over, but the average muster time, so to get a SWAT team in an urban area to a location, was like 55 minutes. So it's not something that happens instantly. The SWAT team in most cities is not sitting around and waiting for patrol officers to call them to a scene. And a lot of the same circumstances with crisis negotiators, which commonly referred to as hostage negotiators, but crisis negotiators, same thing. A lot of times those people have to be called in from other parts of the city, or they're off duty or whatever. So it's entirely possible that patrol division people were the only ones on scene for the majority of this event.
Another point that I saw was about this family staying under the radar, and Child Protective Services or Human Resources never knew about these children and never knew that they were being sexually abused or that there were that many living in one place. People question, how did that happen? Looking at the way he lived explains that. Living in an Army surplus tent in the middle of the woods, who's gonna come out there? Who's gonna report it? They're not going to school. He kept the children away from the public eye. He didn't like them to go out in public very much. They lived on a boat, and even one of the kids said that when they lived on that boat for several months, they had to stay below deck. They weren't allowed to come up because they weren't allowed to be seen because somebody would question it.
Well, right. And you look at most other child abuse cases and that thing, a lot of those things come from members of the community who are mandatory reporters, like you said. So a school teacher would notice something that they then reported to police, or a pediatrician or something like that. So if these kids never got any exposure to those societal elements, then it would be a low probability that someone else would notice them.
Well, and I can compare this to the Turpin family, which is, we did an episode earlier this year on the Turpin family with all the kids that were being abused and nobody reported. People saw strange goings on. And you look at that and compare it to this because it's similar. There was abuse going home. There were a large number of children. And the Turpin family lived in very public areas where neighbors saw them, areas where neighbors saw them through the windows. And before they were homeschooled, people saw them at school. And it wasn't caught that something was going on with them. So somebody who's staying away from any kind of public scrutiny, it's not going to be seen. Another thing is the mother, Elizabeth, saying she did not know her daughters were being sexually abused. Yet her daughters and her nieces are coming up pregnant. Whether she knew or not, I don't think Elizabeth was in any way capable of judging what was right and wrong. She had been led and abused and brainwashed by Marcus Wesson since she was 8 years old.
Yeah, and I don't know, that might, because of the circumstances, absolve her of some criminal culpability. But unfortunately, in my mind, it makes it where, Child Protective Services probably never let her have, in my mind, they wouldn't let, if she's unable to distinguish that that's wrong, then she doesn't need to have kids living with her. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, but she's older now. Her kids are adults.
Right, right.
But, yeah, it's sad all around that he created his own cult by making his cult, like procreating to make his own cult.
It's just another one of those really far out there stories. I don't know where you found this one, but it's strange.
Well, and it started out initially when the standoff happened and news cameras showed up when they started bringing bodies out and then started bringing coffins out. And it didn't get national attention because shortly thereafter, the Michael Jackson child molestation scandal was going on. So that had complete attention, and you didn't really hear a whole lot about this. But in the area, in Fresno and in surrounding areas in California, it was well known. It is a horrific situation, and like I said, you can compare it kind of close with the Turpin family, although that one didn't end in death and this ended in 9 deaths. It's still kind of closely aligned with the things going on in the house, and nobody knowing or nobody doing anything.
Yeah, just a twisted situation. Well, we hope you enjoyed this week's case, and as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.